it's Alabama Annie with part 4 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. I sat quietly beside my aunt and with tears streaming down my cheeks as she passed me a hanky telling me not to cry, babbling on about how much I'd like it in Starlight, about my very own room and my new school and all of the friends I'd make, but all I could think of was Miss Martha and Mama. As I looked out those windows at the changing countryside, we were leaving the city now, driving past farms and through little towns as the morning moved into midday and the sun was higher in the sky. And around lunchtime, we stopped at a roadside diner for hamburgers and ice cream before driving on. And I must have fallen asleep in the back seat because when I awoke, the car had stopped and I realized Mr. Harvey was carrying me through a door, moving in a bright yellow kitchen. And for a moment before I closed my eyes again, as he laid me on a soft bed, I thought I saw Miss Martha standing beside the door. Waking up at the tavern. I awoke that next morning in a room that looked like a picture I had once seen in a Sears catalog. There were frilly pink curtains hanging on the windows and floral wallpaper with a matching spread, and as I sat up and blinked in the bright morning sunlight, I rubbed my eyes thinking I must be dreaming. But as I looked around the room, I noticed my very own dolls and all of my books from home, and the chest was full of clothes. At first, I had no idea how they had come to be in this room, hanging in the cedar chest, until I remembered that big moving truck had come to our house and taken everything away. I had just thrown back the covers of the bed when a woman walked through the door. She was wearing a pink bathrobe and slippers with an apron tied around her middle and a hair bonnet on her head like the one Miss Martha and Mama always wore. She stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, smiling at me. She walked over to the bed and passed me a bathrobe and slippers from a chair nearby and said, "Good morning, Miss Maggie." She handed me my bathrobe and I pulled it on, looking up at her. I knew I'd seen her before, but it took me a moment to remember her name. "You're Miss Hattie," I exclaimed. "Why, yes, I am," she laughed as she offered me her hand, leading me out of the bedroom into a hallway. She pointed to a bathroom and said for me to go in and wash up. So I went inside and closed the door behind me and stood looking around. There was a deep bathtub and a sink with the toilet and my own little step stool from home to reach the water in the sink for when I brushed my teeth and washed my face. There were some pink towels hanging on the rack nearby. I picked up a new toothbrush and paste from the sink and brushed my teeth. I peed in the toilet and flushed it. I splashed my face with soapy water and dried my hands on one of those big pink towels. When I stepped out of the bathroom, Miss Hattie was waiting for me at the end of the hall, and I followed her out into the brightly lit yellow kitchen I had recalled from the night before. It smelled good in the kitchen, like one of Mama's Sunday morning breakfasts. Then I looked to my left and I saw Mr. Harvey sitting at the table with another man who looked a little like him, but older. They both stood up when I walked in, and Mr. Harvey pulled out a chair for me, and I sat down looking at the other man, who he introduced as his brother, John. Mr. John smiled down at me and shook my hand and said, "Now you must be Maggie." Before I could answer, Hattie brought our plates of food to the table along with a big bowl of gravy and homemade buttered biscuits, and we were all joining hands to say a prayer. I was hungry and helped myself to everything as Mr. Harvey smiled at me. "Miss Hattie likes a girl with a good appetite," he exclaimed as she laughed, telling me how much I was going to love it here at the tavern and how much fun I was going to have when I noticed that Aunt Mary wasn't at breakfast, and I asked where she was. Mr. John looked from Hattie to Harvey and laughed. He told me he couldn't remember the last time she'd been at the breakfast table and that she liked to sleep in late. I'd never heard of anyone sleeping in late at home. Mama never had, nor had Miss Martha. They'd always been up with the sun, and I had never been very far behind them. As I ate, I looked around the kitchen and thought to myself that our whole house in Birmingham would have fit into that one big room. And then I recalled just how large the tavern had seemed to me when we'd visited before. I was afraid I might get lost in the place and said so, but Hattie told me not to worry, telling me that they would all show me around the place that day. After breakfast, I helped her to clear the table, just like I always did at home for Mama and Miss Martha, and when I was done, she told me to go to my room and get dressed. She said she'd laid some clothes out for me on the bed, so I hurried back to my room and pulled on my own coveralls and one of my favorite shirts as she came in to help me, saying that Mr. John was waiting for me. And I couldn't wait to see everything, so I raced out the back door to meet him on the porch. I followed him to the barn, where he kept all of his tools and the tractor for the garden, and showed me the chicken house and even let me feed them. After that, he pointed to a cabin beside the barn, saying that that's where Mr. Harvey lived. We walked past his cabin along a trail into the woods and came to the bank of a river. I could hear the water singing before we even got to it, and it sparkled in the sun like shiny diamonds. Mr. John pointed to his favorite fishing spot and showed me a good swimming hole just a little upstream. It even had a rope swing, but he warned me I should never come to the river alone, that it could be dangerous, and that I could drown before any help would ever arrive, and he made me promise I would never go swimming or wading alone, and I promised I wouldn't. Then we walked out of the woods as I followed him back toward the tavern, pausing at the garden where he told me he would soon be planting corn, beans, tomatoes, squash, and peppers. And he said that I could even help him plant the garden if I'd like, and I told him I'd like that very much. That I had helped Miss Martha and Mama pick tomatoes and squash in the summer. At the side of the kitchen again, he pointed to a small door under the floor of the big porch, and he told me there was an old cistern down there. A cistern, he said, was a place where they caught rainwater, and beyond that was a cellar. He said that it was very dangerous under there. He opened the small door under the porch that led down into the darkness just to let me see. A waft of cool, dank air escaped, and we heard something slither in the darkness. He said snakes and spiders loved the damp and the dark, and that was where they lived. And he said there was also broken glass under there, so I should never go there. I looked into the dark space and told him he didn't have to worry about me going into that space at all, that I was glad when he closed the little door again and bolted it shut. We moved on. The tavern was surrounded on two sides by a big lawn with shade trees. It was as big as a park where Mama used to take me to play near our house, a wide expanse of grass and trees. He pointed in the distance toward a 2-lane road leading up from a place he called Little Will's Valley. And on the other side of that road, high on a hill, sat a big white building. He said it was a hotel. I could see it was much larger than the tavern, and while the tavern was faded brown, the hotel was painted a gleaming white. Stone steps led up from the road to a wide front porch and the front of it, and I could see it had 2 stories and a round tower at one end. "Can we go and see it?" I asked, and he said that we could. So we walked to the edge of the 2-lane road hand in hand, just as several cars drove past. And he paused, warning me again never to cross the road without an adult. I held his hand and we climbed the stairs to the big front porch of the hotel. There were a lot of rocking chairs and tables where some ladies sat nearby and two old men were playing a game of checkers. John tipped his hat to all of them as we walked through the wide double doors from the porch into a big room with a huge fireplace. The big room looked like a furniture store. There were sofas and chairs everywhere and brightly colored paintings on the walls and another door I could see through that led into what looked like a big dining room with lots of tables and chairs and even a baby grand piano beneath some windows. A man stepped out of the door from behind the counter and smiled at us, walking around the counter to shake Mr. John's hand and then turned his attention to me. The man bent down, looking at me with a smile and a wink. He was a funny man with a wild tuft of white hair atop his head and a wiggly white mustache below his pointy nose where his eyeglasses were balanced. "This must be Miss Maggie," the man said, and introduced himself and took my hand. "My name is Uncle Harry, Maggie," he said. "I do believe I have 2 big slices of chocolate cake for you and Mr. John," he said, as we followed him around the counter into another big kitchen where several people were busy preparing food.